Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Today's podcast is an interesting one. I have an organisation joining me who we've done a couple of podcasts before, not for a while though. So I'm quite looking forward to getting to the teeth of this discussion. I'll introduce our guest in a minute and we'll do the fundamentally different question for those of you who are maybe listening to the podcast for the first time. The fundamentally different question is a completely random question, not related to HR, that we like to drop in as a little bit of an icebreaker, a little bit of a check-in, a little bit of fun. In terms of framing today's podcast, we've been speaking to a lot of chief people officers at Lace Partners around some of the big challenges they've had, both back end of 2024 and as we entered into 2025. One of the big challenges, which you'll be familiar with if you're reading the news at all, is that HR teams, but businesses as well, are being tasked with doing a lot more for less. The UK has faced a productivity gap over the last decade plus, really. There's been challenges around productivity in the UK, but that's really coming to a crunch with certain type of legislation, which is also just layering on top of existing pressures businesses face. My guest is Simon Fowler, and he heads up the team at Empowering People. How are you doing, Simon?
I'm doing very well, Chris. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm interested to get into the detail of this because we're talking to CPOs and CHROs quite a lot. So it'd be really interesting to get an Empowering People perspective in terms of some of these areas. What we need to do first is a bit of a check-in. If you can let our wonderful listener know a little bit about yourself and also Empowering People, just talk us about that link and the business itself.
Yeah, sure. I'm the group CEO for Empowering People Group. I've been around in the business now for about 18 months, and the business was originally formed from 4 businesses, now very much a single business, very much focused on the ER space. And as our strapline says, simplifying issues. And that's what we aim to do.
Cool. Lovely. And yourself? What's your sort of background?
My background is technology and services. I've been in it for longer than I care to think about, but always with a bent towards the people technology space. Coming to Empowering People Group was a fantastic move for me. And 18 months later, it still feels exactly the same way.
Nice. Right, let's get into this fundamentally different question before we get into the real meat of today's podcast. And that's a good segue because I've been getting into watching YouTube videos where chefs compare certain types of food. Last night, I watched a video in which a couple of chefs were comparing the perfect type of beef. So whether it's Aberdeen Angus, Wagyu or Frisian cows, they were doing a full analysis. If you could pick any food stuff that a chef would do a little analysis on, what would you go for? What would be the food stuff that you'd say I'd really love a proper analysis on?
Well, that's actually quite funny because I think you just mentioned probably most of my favourite foodstuffs in one go. For me, I am a massive meataholic. Beef is my favourite substance in the world. But that would have been interesting to watch, and I might get that from you. If I was going to choose another one, I would probably choose chilies. So I really like chilies, not for the really crazy hotness, but for the different flavours you can get out of different chilies. So I think an analysis on that would be fantastic.
Love that. Getting yourself a little Scoville scale going. Which one, whether I touched a Carolina Reaper or stick to the jalapenos, I'm with.
Yeah, I'm not a big lover of the really, really stupidly hot because I would feel that eating is not meant to be some sort of challenge.
Let's talk a little bit around some of the challenges that businesses are facing at the moment. At the time of recording, as we were just saying in the virtual green room, the Employee Rights Bill, there's still iterations going on, passed to House of Lords. I don't think we want to go into too much detail about what's been said so far, but I do think it poses an interesting discussion around the impact that businesses are being faced with, and HR teams as well, are being faced with in terms of their cost pressures. We had from the budget last year, the national insurance contributions, which come into force at the beginning of April, and that's going to hit bottom line of many businesses. And we're even doing a little bit of work internally at Lace around putting together a piece on what should HR teams be focusing on. So I guess my first question for you is your perception on how businesses have been impacted by some of these changes. And then if there's any specific bits that you want to pick out that our listeners should call attention to, then please feel free to go for it.
I think in terms of how the businesses have been affected, they're being affected massively on NICs, but also the movement on the threshold around minimum wage is really impacting our customers and the marketplace generally. I spoke with a retailer, not one of our customers, but somebody we were talking to, and the impact of those increases was an additional £40 million on their wage bill. That was a reasonable size retailer, but some of our customers who are even larger, we've heard numbers of 100 plus million just to cover that cost. The movement on the minimum wage threshold was quite a surprise to business generally. They hadn't budgeted and weren't prepared for it. And we're now seeing a situation where in the period of lowest hiring confidence in a decade, apart from the pandemic, generally lowest hiring confidence, resources are really tight. We're seeing in the news all the time that cost cutting is becoming a business priority at a time when actually the changes that are coming through the new regulations and stuff is going to add so much complexity and work for HR teams, but also really importantly to our overstretched managers, accidental managers as I refer to them. I think it's a really difficult time for them. Primary concern is the increased admin burden, potential for increased employment disputes, and that manager capability gap. I did a talk on it at Gartner Reimagined. I gave an example of myself 20 years ago when I came across the first time somebody wanted to raise a serious grievance with me as their line manager. I'll be honest, that first one, I was like, okay, where do I go from here? I've had some training, but actually that was like 12 months ago, probably 2 years ago. It's like, where do I go from here? And I think if I look at what's been added to the burden of managers since then and what's coming down the road, it's really overwhelming.
That's a really interesting point. And I guess it comes to one of the areas we're looking at, but you guys will be looking at as well, is what can be done in terms of mitigating some of these issues. Because as you said, one organisation you work with £40 million plus worth of costs through things like national insurance. Well, the answer there can't just be, well, let's work out what £40 million worth of reductions in headcount would cost, and that'll be the answer. There must be different ways to find efficiencies. And one of the things that we've been talking about is from the technology side. So I wanted to get your thoughts about what some of your clients are looking at in terms of how do we avoid just saying, right, we need to make X amount of cost savings as a business. Is there ways in which they're looking at technology to maybe, and from a HR perspective, maybe it's that, okay, how do we self-serve our managers better? There's something around upskilling managers to be able to deal with it, as you mentioned, and there's something about technology as well. So just want to get some thoughts around perhaps a couple of those angles.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're not in a period where businesses have been overly resourced. Everywhere you go, you see the effects and the impact of people not having enough resource already. So if you consider the option to take people out of organizations, that's just not going to work. You're going to start cutting into your mainline employees, colleagues that have been there for years, who've got all the information. I don't think as a business leader, that can be the way forward. For us, and talking to our customers, it's about efficiency. You mentioned manager empowerment, and that's a huge one for our customers and for us. We've got to make sure that everybody in the business is better at what they're doing. And managers that have been promoted because they're great at something. I come from a technology background, numerous managers who were absolutely technical geniuses ended up, and probably still end up, managing people completely the wrong place for them to be. For me, it's about training managers, making them more efficient and able to deal with the people management side of a business. I'm sure you can help with our ever decreasing size of HR team. And we know that's going to happen because it happens all the time, unfortunately. And so if you've got less people in your people team, you need to make the managers do more of that work. From our perspective, Empower Tech Solution, that's what it's all about. If you talk to our customers, and Sainsbury's, 63% of their managers are dealing with our cases all the way through. I think technology is absolutely at the forefront of what's going on. No conversation about technology would be correct without the mention of AI at the moment. We're looking at enhancing our solution with various AI tech. Everybody in our space, particularly the enterprise, is concerned about ER advice being given by a virtual agent because you get the hallucinations that AI still does. Organizations are being forced. It's almost like a perfect storm. We're in the second chapter of AI, whereas last year we were in chapter one. Chapter one in my book was really like everybody's excited. Nobody really knows what to do with it. There's a few sort of kind of cool use cases. I'm not sure we trust it and not sure quite how to use it. I think what I'm seeing this year from ourselves as well is that people are excited about AI and what it can do going forward. Then you start getting into the conversations about, does it replace people? No, it doesn't. It just makes them more efficient. For us with the Empower solution, I think is key.
It's that augmentation of job and the tasks you're doing versus the automation of the tasks that you're doing. I want to talk a little bit around, you talked about their technology, but there's also the ability of businesses to skill up their managers to deliver. It was a really interesting example you gave of line managers themselves doing the ER stuff. How vital, it's probably quite a leading question and a bit of an obvious one, but I want you to build on it if that's all right. Sure. I want to talk about how vital that piece is around being able to accurately reskill line managers to have the tools rather than just saying, we've got a piece of tech we've given you now, you guys crack on. Because if you're first coming in as a line manager, it's really, really daunting. So you need to be handheld in certain bits, right? Like most of those accidental managers don't come in as people managers. They come in because they're a superb engineer or they're an expert in marketing. So just get some thoughts around the value of being able to upskill people in those particular intangible things, and impacts AI as well. Because one of the things people have said is that AI can help you augment and automate some tasks, but it doesn't allow for things like empathy.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so if I look at our Empower technology, when I first had that grievance, I probably hadn't had any. I said 12 months. I'm going to guess it was probably 2 years, really. Perhaps I should have gone on the course, didn't go on it. And so I think the thing with grievances particularly is that hopefully your managers aren't experiencing it on a day-to-day basis. So for us, the way we approach it is with the guided journeys. A manager goes on and instead of worrying about what they can't say, what documentation they need to get, there's a journey that takes them through it. And what we're also seeing some of our customers do is embed training at the point at which it's required. So use the old example, which is having difficult conversations, which is a great piece of e-learning. You know, you could go on it, but that was 12 months ago. Am I going to remember it? Whereas if I start a guided journey and I haven't got the colleague in front of me, there's the training. I can just do that because now it's really relevant to what I need to do. What we find with managers of our customers is once they start using it, it gives them confidence that they can deal with these issues. Going back to your food analogy, red wine gets better with age. Generally, ER issues do not get better with age. They just get much worse. One of our customers, Wix, uses our solution. They've reduced their employment tribunals by 50%. The average payout went from 14,000 to 3,000. If you speak to CPOs, they will tell you that a lot of employment tribunals are not lost because the organization did anything wrong, but they can't prove they did it right. They can't prove that they followed a process. That's what Empower, particularly for Wix in that example, takes away. Once your managers feel empowered to actually deal with these, you see all of these benefits. The manager experience, we talk about employee experience all the time, but I find that not enough people talk about the manager experience and what the manager is going through right now. Managers might be for all the wrong reasons, but they're managers because generally they're your best people. Making them efficient, making them excited about doing their job, a part of their job that they're probably a bit scared of right now, seems like one of the most logical responses to where we are right now. One of the things that I get frustrated about is I talk to CPOs and they say, oh, our managers aren't ready for this. And I almost want to put my head in my hands. And because my response wants to be, and I suppose it will be, my response wants to be, if you really think your managers aren't ready for this now, what are they doing now in those situations? They're putting it off, they're fudging it, or they're putting a ridiculous burden on your HR and ER team.
That's a really, really good point. I want to ask you about the focus of what we're talking about at the moment is around this idea of HR being asked to do more for less, find efficiencies, not just cutting headcounts. And you've talked about one solution to give power to line managers to self-serve a little bit. If I'm a CHRO coming to you now and saying, okay, that's great, but my business is currently saying to me, you've got to make cost reductions. What advice would you give to that CHRO in terms of building their business case for being able to say, well, look, you've told me I've got to save £250,000. I think I can deliver on what you're needing in terms of the business problem to deliver more productivity by embedding some more technology so that our managers can be more self-serving. What sort of advice or guidance have you got for me so that I can tell the story to my C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And all of our prospects and customers have gone through exactly that business case scenario with us. So I suppose there are various ways to look at it. The first I would say is it's got to be utterly data driven. With all due respect to my colleagues in a people function, generally I find that their business cases are quite generic. If you're going to convince your CFO that your business case is absolutely bomb-proof and is really going to do it, because, my CFO's heard me justify quite a lot of things, and perhaps they weren't quite delivered the way they were going to be, but you've got to base it on actual facts and be able to justify why those facts are actually going to result in the savings you want. Although businesses are looking for cost cutting, actually, quite often it's not because the businesses aren't doing well. It's because we've had this artificial thing thrown into the economy. And so for various reasons, whether it's share price, whether it's investors, whatever it is, they've got to kind of find their way back to where they were from a financial footing. But actually, we find with some of our businesses and customers, they're still growing. So part of that business case to me is, we're not going to necessarily shed people from our people team. As we grow, we won't need to increase the size of that team so we can get more growth from having the same size team. Unfortunately, sometimes it does result in headcount reductions. For me, those would be the areas to look at.
We're coming up towards the end of the podcast, but I want to give you kind of a bit of a free swim opportunity in terms of any other steps or bits of advice for HR teams or things you've been hearing to help counter some of these challenges around the ER bill, national insurance increases, or advice for teams.
I'm not a CHRO, but I deal with them all the time. What we as a people function must do is embrace a kind of strategic and proactive stance to effectively managing the current landscape. I mean, what we're talking about really is being more efficient. And in a way, you could argue that's what we should all be all the time. So a continual improvement. Why wouldn't we be more efficient? And I think evaluating the whole piece around people, the way that you use technology, the way that you use outsourced services. I mean, we're seeing a big move within our base to outsourcing services because obviously if you want to be less affected by increases in NIC, have less people on your actual payroll, but actually get the services from somewhere else. With a lot of our customers where they outsource their ER to us, we can generally do it more efficiently because we've got the technology embedded as well. And obviously we're experts in it. And for those customers where they have it outsourced to us, for their ER teams, they weren't affected by the NIC because that's a problem that I've got to deal with, not them. So I think it's so important that we maintain a strong focus on the employee and management experience, because otherwise you're not going to retain talent. You might be saving some money elsewhere, but if the services that the HR and ER team are providing to the business as a whole, then you obviously increase the risk of disputes, employment tribunals. So actually it just costs you money in other places. It's a bit like putting your finger in the dam and another hole comes out somewhere else, really. So I think it's still the things about creating a positive and productive environment are still really important for me. And I think that's the areas that I would say, we've got to look at. As I said earlier, the problem we've got is it's kind of artificial. It's an artificial situation we find ourselves in. But actually, I think it means that we can do some of the things that we've been thinking about doing. And now we've got a justification to look at efficiency. As always, employee wellbeing and rigorous compliance are still top of the list, and we can't forget it.
Absolutely. A really good end point to bookend our conversation today. I think you're spot on with regards to the importance of that compliance piece. What we're advocating at Lace, and you guys as well, is the answer isn't always more cost is being added to a business, so let's go to the lowest common denominator, which is headcount. There are ways in which you can deliver efficiencies, whether it's through outsourcing, whether it's through improvement in your tech stack, whether it's making sure that you've got your operating model in place. We will have a paper which we're releasing, which will look at some of these elements. But where can people find you, Simon, or empower the guys that are empowering people? Is it empoweringpeople.com, I'd imagine, or
empoweringpeoplegroup.com.
empoweringpeoplegroup.com. So if you want to find out a little bit more about Simon and his team, you can visit their website. Thank you very much for listening. And for Simon, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Chris.
It's been great having you on. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast as much as I've enjoyed recording it with the wonderful people from Empowering People. Please feel free to give us a 5-star review from myself and from Simon. Thank you very much for joining us. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.